My farm had been there for decades, even before the HOA decided that the area was perfect for building luxury homes with perfectly mowed lawns and rules stricter than a maximum security prison. When they started crowding the neighborhood with absurd regulations, I ignored it because I knew they had no power over me. But that never stopped them from trying. They had already tried to complain about the smell of the stable, the noise of the roosters, the color of my barn. None of it worked, so now they decided to attack in another way. One day, I picked up my mail and saw an envelope with HOA letterhead. I sighed before I opened it, because nothing useful ever came out of those communications. But when I finally looked at the letter, I almost laughed at how ridiculous it was. The HOA was creating a parking fee for pickup trucks and large vehicles. They claimed that trucks and tractors were disharmonizing the landscape and blocking the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. The notice said that any vehicle other than a sedan or small SUV would have to pay a monthly fee to be parked within the residential area. In other words, they were charging me to park my own truck on my own farm. I threw the letter on the table and looked at it like someone looking at a poorly written kidnapping note. It couldn't be serious. Did they really think they could run my property like that? That they could charge me to park a tractor that I used for work every day? But then I started to notice the other neighbors. The HOA wasn't just targeting me. Other people in the neighborhood also had pickup trucks and were just as furious as I was. People who needed a big vehicle to pull trailers, carry tools, or simply because they liked driving a machine that didn't look like a toy car. Everyone commented, but as always, no one wanted to be the first to confront the HOA. So, since I was already their favorite target, I decided to do what no one else was doing. I decided to knock on the door of the woman who was behind this brilliant idea. Her house was one of those monuments to wasted money. A white facade, plants in geometrically aligned pots, curtains that looked as if they had never been opened. As soon as I knocked on the door, I heard hurried footsteps on the other side, and, seconds later, there she was, with that artificial smile that only people who think they're in charge of everything can give. What a surprise! What can I do for you? I lifted the letter and waved it in the air. Has the HOA now decided that it can charge for the size of other people's cars? Her smile got a little tenser. Oh, that? Yes. It was a decision based on feedback from the community. Many people feel that large pickup trucks are disturbing the harmony of the neighborhood. I laughed. That's funny, because I live here and I've never heard anyone complain about it. She tilted her head, as if I were a difficult student to educate. Well, not everyone likes confrontation, but we made this decision based on what's best for everyone. We believe it will encourage a more balanced environment. Balanced? You mean you want a neighborhood full of tiny electric carts that can barely run on the dirt road? Her smile disappeared for a second before returning. The important thing is that we now have clear regulations. The tax will be applied from next month. I took a deep breath. And you think you can charge me for that? She shrugged. We enforce the community guidelines. And that's when I realized she thought she had won. She thought I was just going to accept this bullshit and pay like everyone else. Ah, but I wasn't like everyone else. So I smiled back. Good to know. Let's see how it works in practice. She blinked a few times, trying to understand what I meant, but I was already turning my back and walking away. Because if they thought they could charge me to park my truck, then I was going to make sure that every penny of that fee was as painful as possible for them. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, full of energy to put my plan into action. If the HOA wanted to charge me to park pickup trucks and tractors on my own farm, then I was going to make sure it was worth every penny. I picked up my truck and drove into town to do a little special shopping. After half an hour, I returned home with exactly what I needed: traffic cones, metal signs, and insulation tape. Oh, and of course, a construction helmet just to make it look even more official. Meanwhile, the neighbors began to notice my movements. First, a few curious onlookers passed slowly in front of my property, trying to understand why I was installing huge signs in my own yard. Then, the whispering started. But no one had the courage to ask me directly what I was doing, which was great, because I wanted the first person to see my masterpiece to be the woman who had come up with the brilliant idea of the fee. And at the end of the morning, there she was. I knew she'd come. People like her always come when they think someone is doing something outside the rules. When I saw her gleaming white car pull up in front of my farm, I leaned on the shovel I was holding and gave her my best satisfied farmer's smile. She got out of the car wide-eyed, looking at the signs and cones I had spread at the entrance to my farm. "What are these?" I pretended to be surprised. "Ah, good morning. This question mark, I'm just adapting my property to the new HOA rules." She blinked a few times. "What do you mean?" I pointed to the metal signs I had installed near the main entrance. On them was written in very large letters, "Private parking for large vehicles, fee required." Underneath that, an amount 3 times higher than what the HOA was trying to charge me. It took her a few seconds to understand what she was seeing. Then she looked at me as if I had just lost my mind. "You can't charge for parking on your farm." I crossed my arms. "But you can charge me for parking. That's different." "Of course it is. Here, at least, I warned you before shoving an absurd charge through your letterbox." She turned red. I knew I was stepping on her toes, and nothing gave me more pleasure than seeing this woman finally speechless. But I wasn't finished yet. "Oh, and just to be clear, any HOA vehicle that enters my property now has to pay. Private security vehicles, service trucks, board cars, if they park here, they'll be charged the same week." She swallowed. "That doesn't make sense." "Well, you said yourself that we enforce community guidelines. I'm just making sure that my farm is in line with the new standards." The look of panic on her face was priceless. For the first time, it felt like the weight of her own rules was beginning to tighten around her neck. She turned sharply and headed back to her car, getting out of there faster than I thought her car could go. But the best was yet to come. Over the next few weeks, my little protest began to cause a domino effect. Some neighbors began to wonder if this parking fee really made sense. Complaints grew, and some people started boycotting HOA events, saying they were tired of paying for things they had never asked for. But the icing on the cake came when a maintenance truck hired by the HOA had to stop in front of my farm to fix a light pole. And, of course, like any large vehicle, I charged the fee. I sent a formal charge to HOA headquarters, attached photos of the truck parked on my property, and a copy of the community parking rules. If they were going to charge me for using my own space, then it was only fair that they pay for the privilege of using mine. The result? Exactly 3 days later, I received a new notice from the HOA stating that, after review, the parking fee was being revoked. No explanation, no attempt to justify it. They just gave up. And the woman who invented this rule? Well, after that, she started to avoid crossing paths with me in the street. And I made a point of leaving my private parking signs there for a few more weeks, just to remind everyone what happens when they try to mess with someone who doesn't take any crap. The HOA may have canceled the parking fee, but I knew this woman wasn't going to swallow defeat so easily. People like her don't accept losing. They just back down, pretend nothing happened, and wait for the next opportunity to shove another absurd rule down everyone's throat. So I didn't take down my parking signs. I kept everything in place, clearly visible, as a permanent reminder that any attempt to screw me over would come back to them tenfold. And, as expected, her revenge came. A week after the revocation of the fee, I received another letter from the HOA. I didn't even have to open it to know that shit was coming. But when I read it, I realized that this time they were trying to be sneakier. The document stated that commercial vehicles could no longer be parked inside the residential area. According to them, vans, trailers, tractors, and any vehicle used for commercial purposes should be stored outside the neighborhood in a parking lot designated by the association. In other words, after failing in their attempt to charge me to park, they now wanted to ban me from parking. I laughed out loud. Did they really think I was going to let this go? The next day, I was ready for the second round. But this time, I wasn't just going to resist. I was going to turn their lives into a logistical hell. I took my truck and went to a building materials store. I bought easels, reflective strips, and a whole roll of black tarpaulin. I spent the rest of the afternoon working, and by the end of the day, my farm was transformed. The next morning, the woman from the HOA showed up at my property before 8, probably because someone had called her in desperation. When she got out of the car, I could almost feel the anger bubbling up inside her. She took one look at what I had done and completely lost it. Right at the entrance to my farm, where my truck and tractor used to be, I had set up a barrier complete with giant signs announcing, "Parking HOA, commercial vehicles only here." And behind the makeshift fence, nothing but an empty area fenced off with insulation tape. I had turned my farm space into the official HOA parking lot for commercial vehicles. She pointed at the signs, furious. "What is that?" I feigned surprise. "I'm just following the new rule. You said that commercial vehicles need to be parked outside the neighborhood. So I decided to help out and create a proper space. Now, any HOA maintenance truck can park here. Of course, with a small fee. After all, it's a community service." She blinked several times, trying to understand how this was happening. "You can't just decide that this is the HOA parking lot, but you can decide that I can't park my vehicles on my farm?" She opened her mouth, closed it again, then took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "This is ridiculous. You can't charge for parking again." I shrugged. "So the HOA is going to provide free parking for residents' pickup trucks and tractors? Because if so, you can let me know where it is, and I'll take my vehicles there now." Silence. I knew she didn't have an answer. Of course, there was no parking lot. They wanted everyone with a big vehicle to just disappear. I continued. "And look, since I'm always thinking about the good of the community, if you want, I can expand this area to accommodate more vehicles, maybe even charge a small monthly fee to maintain the space. After all, if you think you can decide where everyone should park, then it's only fair that someone organizes it properly." She was already so red, she looked like she was going to explode. But I knew I couldn't stop myself. After all, I was just following the rules they themselves made up. She stared at me for a few more seconds, and then simply turned her back and walked away. But I knew this war wasn't over yet. The next few days were wonderful. Every time a service truck needed to park in the neighborhood, drivers were confused when they saw my sign saying that this was the official HOA parking lot. I even caught a few trying to figure out if it was real or a prank. Meanwhile, the neighbors began to realize what was going on. The HOA didn't have a real parking lot for pickup trucks and commercial vehicles. They just wanted to stick a random rule in without thinking about the consequences. But now, with my official parking lot, every time a resident saw a large vehicle parked in front of another house, they started complaining. After all, if there's a rule, why isn't it being enforced? The plan was working better than I expected. But then came the HOA's final move, and I knew that woman was desperate. A new notice was distributed in the neighborhood, this time saying that all the new parking rules were being reconsidered, and that the previous guidelines would apply again until further notice. In other words, they repealed the rule again. 2 failed attempts, 2 public defeats, and now the HOA had a much bigger problem than a truck parked on a farm. They were losing control. And me? Well, I just had to wait, because now it was only a matter of time before the house fell in on this woman. The HOA may have tried to back down to save its own skin, but I knew that woman wasn't going to let it go. People like that don't accept defeat. They just pretend nothing happened while they plot their next move. But her problem was that, this time, everyone had seen the circus on fire. The attempt to ban pickup trucks and tractors had become a laughing stock. The residents' Facebook group was full of memes and indirection about the HOA's official parking, and I knew that trust in the administration was crumbling when even the most neutral neighbors started complaining. And that's how the final blow came. 2 weeks after the official repeal of the rules, I received another letter from the HOA, but this time it wasn't another attempt to impose absurd rules. It was an invitation to an emergency board meeting, and at the top of the letter, in bold letters, was the subject: Vote to remove the current HOA president. I laughed so hard I almost cried. They were throwing their own leader to the wolves. On the day of the meeting, I made a point of attending. Normally, I avoided this kind of meeting because I knew it was just an excuse for that woman to shove more regulations down everyone's throats. But this time, I wanted to see everything happen live. The community room was packed. For the first time, the people who usually kept quiet were there, with their arms crossed and their expressions closed. Some of the older residents were sitting at the front, holding up copies of the regulations as if they were evidence in a trial. And then she walked in, the woman who tried to turn the entire neighborhood into an extension of her own ego, the woman who thought she could control everything and everyone. She still maintained what was left of her haughty posture, but you could see in her eyes that she knew she had lost. The meeting was short. There wasn't much debate. The damage had already been done. Someone stood up and began reading a document listing all the recent complaints against her administration, from fines imposed without criteria to the parking fiasco. And when one of the residents asked out loud, "Who here agrees that it's past time for new leadership?" almost every hand in the room went up. It was at that moment that I saw something rare. She was speechless. Normally, she would try to argue, give a ready-made speech about how rules are necessary to maintain the harmony of the community. But this time, none of that mattered. She just closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and, without looking at anyone, got up and left. The next day, there was a removal car in front of her house, and 2 days later, she no longer lived in the neighborhood. Nobody knew where she went. Some said she moved to a gated community, where she could control the neighbors without resistance. Others thought she simply couldn't take the humiliation and decided to start again somewhere else. But what really mattered was that she lost. The HOA still existed, but it was now being run by a group of residents who actually wanted to solve real problems, not make up silly rules. Well, I went back to my normal routine. My trucks and tractors were still parked in the same place, with no one to tell me that they spoiled the harmony of the neighborhood. But every time I passed the woman's old house, now empty and for sale, I allowed myself a small smile, because, in the end, she tried to kick me out of my own home, and it was she who ended up leaving. And if you liked it, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and leave a like.